Hey there, welcome back to Constructive Consulting. My name's Laz. In my last video, I discussed about what are sort of like the high level 5 most important things to kind of consider when building a construction project. Again, we're talking about very, very high level here, so we're considering these 5 points. Last time we talked about start date, finish date, duration, scope, and quality. Now we're going to get a little bit more into like what duration, start date, and end date are. Okay, so in construction we have these things called appendices, and appendices are usually things that are attached to the main contract. And in another video we'll probably talk more in depth about what contracts constitute, what it takes to build and according to a contract. In many countries it's kind of different. I've now worked in a few different countries. I've worked in the United States and Canada. I've never worked in Europe or anywhere else, but the Canadian system is very different from the American system, so understanding how contract legislation works in both countries is actually quite important. But I'm digressing. I want to focus on the topic of the first 3 of the top 5 that we mentioned in the last video, that being start date, end date, and duration. Okay, so what is a start date? So essentially what a start date is kind of like a kickoff date for when the project begins. It's when we leave the phase of tender and we enter the phase of construction. So once a contract is awarded and it leaves the phase of tender and it enters the phase of construction, now you've entered the construction period, meaning a couple of things have to happen in order for a start date to actually kick off, meaning that you need to have your permits in order. So whatever city you're building in, so let's say pick a random city in the world, Los Angeles. I don't live in Los Angeles, I live in Vancouver, Canada, but we're just going to say Los Angeles for an example here. So Los Angeles has many different prefectures, so let's say West Hollywood. Okay, the city of West Hollywood would have a set of permitting guidelines and zoning that you would have to go through and follow through on. So usually early in the tender stage, one of the people in the company would have gone through that entire process through the RFQ and proposal period. You would then address all the items to achieve that permit, and then you would obviously pay the city to obtain the permit to build. This is called a building permit. Usually what's associated with a building permit is a set of building permit drawings that have to come from the consultant team, which we will talk in another video. I'll explain how the relationship between stakeholders all work. So that's the most key important thing about start dates, is having the documents in order to actually start the project, having your field resources placed in, ready to go in place. So all your primary contractors and subcontractors to be ready, like to hit the ground running once that date is achieved. So who would be the key players? For example, you would have the structural team. So they would be a company that you would hire on a subcontract basis, and that contract should be well in advance approved and ready to go once the construction date is confirmed, so that they know what they're building. They have a first preliminary set of drawings. Then the next is the concrete team, and then we can get further into all the different divisions of how labor is broken down in Canada primarily, and a little bit in the United States as well, but we're going to primarily speak about how labor gets divided in Canada. And then all of these things kind of coincide to this important one rule of the start date. So the end date is kind of the same thing. It's kind of a closeout period, right? So we need to understand, you have the duration of a project, right? There's a beginning, middle, and end, right? The beginning is usually like this kind of kickoff period where, we get our building permit drawings done, we submit our building permit, and now we're in the starting phase of the job, right? So we're doing all of our procurement, we're trying to get ahead of all our purchasing of materials. We're trying to do what's called mobilization, bringing efforts to site, bringing resources to site. So bringing your site trailer over to site, bringing your site boundary and closing the site and taking over the space. So assumption of the space by the contractor, right? These are all provisions that are going to be listed out in the contract. So we can get further into that in more videos, and I can really break it down step by step and exactly how that all works. But for all intents and purposes, I need you to understand that schedule is sort of like a very set in stone thing in the world of construction. So these start dates and end dates, there's many multiple tasks that happen in between the main start date and the main end date, and all these different scopes of work that happen between in this duration that we talked about as point 3, they all each individually have start dates and end dates. So the key here is to kind of see the big picture and see the little piece inside of the big picture and see what will affect what in what manner. So you've probably heard of things like critical path. So there's all these assessment tests that we have to look over when we look at something like a schedule. So the key thing between the first 3 points, start date, end date, and duration, is all of those things are associated with what I just mentioned now called a schedule. When we submit a contract, a prime contract to the owner for approval, and we get the job and we manage to outbid all the other competitors, and now we've assumed control of the construction project, the key thing here to understand is the schedule is what must be followed to the T. So there is a period on the schedule where you achieve like substantially complete, and then a deficiency period to catch up on deficiencies. So we're going to talk about what that looks like. That period after substantial completion is called closeout. So that's sort of towards the end of the job. And in the middle, that's like the bread and butter of the construction period. So that's when we're progressing the most. So I'll speak to what progressing is in yet another video. But essentially what this video is supposed to kind of give you a sense of is the top 5 things we talked about earlier, which was start dates, end dates, durations, scope, and quality. So let me put it this way for you. Every job has essentially 3 metrics, and maybe I'll put up a diagram here to show how that works. But these 3 metrics are budget, okay? They are quality, and they are time. And you've probably seen this triangle that I'm talking about of these 3 metrics in many different engineering courses, or just generally on the internet you will see this. But essentially, when it comes down to any project, these 3 metrics, you can never fully achieve 100% of all of them. So you can have a project that's on time and on budget, but it might lack a little bit in terms of quality. You can have a project that just kicks it out of the water in terms of quality, that's on time, but then you kind of blew the budget a little bit. You exceeded the budget by a certain percentage or margin. Or you can be on budget and on quality, but then it took a little bit longer to build the project. So this is a conversation that you have to have with the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders? What does stakeholder even mean? So when I say stakeholder, there's people who hold a stake in the project coming to an end and being a usable building. So we don't just build buildings here. Buildings are usually commissioned for building by someone who needs a building built. So that would be a business, that would be an organization, or like a large organized body, or a government, or another example would be an agency or a transit service, or any sort of civil service, firefighters, for example, or the city of this city or that city. I won't get specifically into which cities, but you get my point. Buildings are built for a purpose, right? And the purpose has to serve some sort of occupier, right? And the occupier is usually represented by an owner representative, and that person is usually what we would know as the owner. So every contract out there in the world of construction, every single contract has 3 key players. That is the consulting group, that is the owner, and then the contractors, okay? So remember that. And then the other thing to remember is this 3-way relationship that we talked about: on time, on budget, and on quality. So those stakeholders who I mentioned earlier, the contracting team, the ownership group, and the consultants, they all have to know about these other three things that we talked about, which was being on time, on budget, and on quality. So that is a consistent, constant conversation that has to happen, usually in a weekly or bi-weekly period. These are usually known as owner, contractor, architect meetings, or colloquially known as OAC meetings, very critical meetings. This is where we communicate these stakeholder requirements and deadlines and things like this. So I'll have another video for that if you want to really get into how OAC meetings work and how to run the best OAC meeting. But usually on a construction project, throughout its duration, you have what are called internal meetings. So you'll have an internal team. So in a contracting team, who typically works in a contracting team, you'll usually have a project manager, you'll have a site foreman or superintendent, and if it's a bigger project, you might have multiple. We're talking about staffing now, so staffing is a really important thing to understand. So how a project gets staffed is usually done by the directors and the higher ups in the company. They'll pick out who the key players are for each job and figure out who's most suited for that type of scope of work. If you're building a soccer field, it's very different than building a musical theater. Building a musical theater is very different than building a university institution versus a facility for transit. Right? So they figure out people based on their resumes and their internal skills and their education backgrounds, who's best for staffing for those types of projects, right? And their work history and their backgrounds, right? So once that's all figured out and a project is staffed, and this is after we've done our start date and we've achieved our building permit and we are now in the construction phase of the project, we're going to go into who are these people. So again, we have a superintendent, a project manager, and typically like a foreman or a group of foremans. We're not limited to one or two, and usually the superintendent will have an assistant superintendent of some kind or a head foreman, and the project manager will usually have a coordinator of some kind who is, again, on the career path towards being a project manager themselves. So we staff people this way so that the junior, the apprentice, learns from the master, and then it kind of grows that way. So a lot of people coming into construction probably start off as laborer, or they start off as a student in school just not knowing where they want to go in life, or they got a ticket in welding, or they got some sort of ticket in some sort of business background. They can go down these avenues if they join in with a construction company from a very beginner level. They can start off as a coordinator, or they can start off as a health and safety person if they have their level 1 and their level 2. Or they can start off as a construction field hand and then work their way up to foreman, and then maybe general foreman, and then maybe assistant superintendent, and then maybe superintendent. So there's these different career paths. Generally speaking, the superintendent is very site-based, extremely site-based. They have to be there to open and close the site every day. They're responsible for whatever works happen and whatever injuries happen on that site. The project manager is responsible for the actual deliverance of the project, so the start to the finish, and managing all the contracts and managing all the financial aspects. So anything that's financially related or project related or design related to an extent falls on the back of the project manager team. So that's the coordinator and the project manager. And the site team, which is generally the foremans and the superintendents, those two teams under the same company, the contracting company, have to work together to deliver the project, right? So that's how it works internally, and this usually is discussed at an internal team meeting. Internal team meetings usually happen either towards the end of the week or the very beginning of the week, so that it kind of, you load the work week and you kind of progress through the project that way. And then somewhere midweek is where you would likely want to have that owner, architect, contractor meeting that we talked about earlier. So that's how meetings work. We talked about staffing, we talked about meetings, we talked about like what are the 5 key things, we talked about stakeholders. We can go further into like things like pricing and how projects work, but I think in my next video I'm going to talk to you guys exactly about what exactly a project in construction is and what it looks like and what it entails, and I think I might have some graphics up here to show you as well. Anyways, to conclude things, my name is Laz. Again, I've worked in this industry for about 10 years now. I've excelled through the ranks. I started off as like a level 1 coordinator, level 2, level 3 coordinator, senior coordinator, and now finally project manager. And then again, levels in project management. And then I guess the trajectory is to be one day owner of a company of my own, or a director in senior level within an existing firm. What I've noticed, big key takeaways I can give from my career is, it is a good industry to work in. There's tons of money to be made in this industry, tons of money to be lost too, and you can live very well in one of the key G8 nation economies. You can actually do well, if not maybe thrive, if you're very, very good. There's many opportunities of starting your own business too in this industry. But one thing you will really notice working in any city, you will really notice how small the construction industry actually is. There's only maybe like 5 big firms, or 2 or 3 big firms depending on the size of your city, and the turnover rate of employees, many employees leave firms and go to other firms, and like there's a lot of crossover. Sometimes subcontractors leave from their subcontracting firm and come to a general contracting firm, or sometimes consultants become general contractors. All I want to say is that your MO and how you operate and how you treat people will stick with you in your career path forever. So make sure not to burn any bridges, and really make sure to build good bridges with people who will then provide opportunities, provide perhaps a project down the line that you've negotiated through relationships and through good practice that could lead to a project. So that's one key takeaway I'm going to give to anybody kind of coming into this industry is, it's how you behave. It's like lawyers or doctors or any other profession. You need to treat the profession with respect, okay? Which means, and I'll give you an example of what it looks like to not treat it with respect. So what it looks like to not treat it with respect is swearing in meetings, yelling at people, playing sort of semantic games and being dishonest, or having dishonest financial practices. These kinds of things are an easy way to show that you are not someone worthy of doing business. Doing business the honest way, showing transparency in your financials, being clear and direct with your communication via email, being clear and direct with your communication in contract terms. So like speaking the lingo, as they say, knowing what documents to trace, understanding how the contracts function speaks volumes to your credibility. Your credibility is everything. It's very easy to pull the thread and figure out when someone doesn't have their facts straight. One of my senior PMs once upon a time told me, whatever you tell somebody, those are your grounds that you're standing on. So if you're giving specific technical information, you are standing on the grounds of that information. So people are very smart in this industry. If you tell something incorrect, they will then source it out and figure it out. They'll find the email chains, they'll go through the documentation, and they'll source out the exact line where you got it wrong. So just make sure to have double, triple check all of your work, and make sure that your numbers drive. That's what really matters, because there's a lot of money at stake in construction. Construction is a multi-million-dollar industry on the small scale, and on the large and international scale is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So you can imagine what kind of margins. 5% on $1 billion is still a lot of money, right? So just to kind of bring it back down to earth after that, I need you to understand, as a young guy coming into this industry, or girl, you are bound by the credibility of your words. That's sort of the most key thing you need to understand. We'll learn more throughout the course of these videos. We'll learn more about how construction management actually works in Canada and the United States. But the key takeaway here is to study really hard in school and understand the facts on the ground before opening your mouth in a meeting. Thank you. Okay, and we'll talk soon again. My name's Laz once again, and I'll see you in the next video. Make sure to comment, like, and subscribe.